Okay, now that we don't have the fucking pretentious intro that every single YouTuber has, we can start. Yo, the Watcher is low-key bad. Now, don't get me wrong, this video will be me trying to explain why the Watcher has a bad story. Although, know that this video isn't coming from a place of malice. I'm not making it to put the Watcher down or anything. I'm making it because I love Rainward and I want to see it get better. You should also know that the Watcher is my favorite Rainward campaign when it comes to gameplay. There's just something about it which makes me enjoy it to no end. But it's not good just because I personally like it. I played this campaign more than any other Downpour campaign, and today I wanted to focus on its issues and why I think various aspects of it don't work for one reason or another. Now, of course, this most likely isn't the first quote-unquote Watcher bad video, so many people online have explained why Watcher is bad before me. Literally just search up Rainward the Watcher review and there's so much fucking stuff. 1, 2, 3, 4, not this one, 5, 6, not this one, 7, 8, 9. I'm like a year late. You could even call this a retrospective, although I didn't make it with the intention of being one. But most of these videos are now outdated because they were made like 1 per after the Watcher released. And that is another reason why I wanted to make this video. The debate of whether the DLC is good or not is one of the most bad discourses I have ever seen in my life, and I come from the Star Wars community. This topic has been poisoned by the community so bad that there isn't any actual discussion. On one hand, you have people making arguments for why it's bad. Most of the time I have seen arguments from these people, they will either just point out a thing that happens in the DLC and then not elaborate on why it's actually bad, or they will just make an argument that's objectively untrue. The thing with a lot of these people is that they don't really tackle the story outside of very broad concepts, which may make you think that it's because the story is good, but that's not the case, at all. The reason many people don't want to talk about it is because any attempt at actually dissecting the story of the Watcher will inevitably sound like the ramblings of an insane person, which probably makes you think that I am insane.
Yes, I am.
And on the other hand, you have people making really bad defenses for it. There are so many valid criticisms to make for it and so many bad ones to debunk, and the community somehow failed on both ends. But before we get into the story, I want to talk about my issues with the gameplay first. The Watcher's gameplay is actually pretty good right now. Most of the bugs and glitches were fixed, and a bunch of mechanics and creatures were improved. But it still has its flaws. My main issues lie within the Echo plotline and how you're supposed to find them. There still isn't any sort of an indicator whether the region you're currently in has an echo or not, besides the echo tracker which you get in Shattered Terrace. I don't know why I have to get it there. The Watcher would have been massively improved if it was enabled since the start. Why do you have to visit a random region to get it? There's also the fact that after beating the prologue you can get sent to 3 different regions and none of them have an echo in them, which kinda ruins the pacing a bit. I don't know why the stronger storyline in the DLC has to have the worst gameplay, but here we are, I guess. When it comes to the other aspects like the visuals, the music, and the atmosphere, they are pretty good. I don't really want to talk about them right now. Let's get to the more interesting things. Of course, one of the most hated aspects of the DLC on release was its world, or rather a lack of one. But as all Watcher arguments, people misunderstood what was actually wrong with it. The problem isn't with setting the action of the campaign in an entirely different world. In fact, I find that idea very interesting. The problem also doesn't lie in the fact that its regions aren't connected physically. There isn't anything necessarily wrong with not having an interconnected world, especially since most of the Watcher's atmosphere and plot relies on it being the way that it is. But you have to acknowledge that most of the base game region's lore came from seeing how they fit into the larger world. For example, Garbage Wastes are not the most lore-heavy region, but we are able to learn way more about them from the regions that surround them, and how they fit into the larger world. Yes, they are filled with garbage, but that garbage comes directly from many other regions in the world, especially Five Pebbles. whose scale and size is only exemplified by this region. One of the most interesting aspects of the base game, at least to me, was figuring out how exactly these various locations tie into one another. If you were to separate garbage waste from all those other regions, you would have to put heavy work to communicate its lore in the region itself. Which brings me to my main point. If the water regions are to be separated, then I expect that each of them is going to be fully developed. Since they aren't a part of a larger world, they have to stand on their own. I expect to learn all about them and what they are. For example, I would expect that I would learn all about the verdant waterways. Yes, sure, I know that they have a lot of water in them, but what is it for? Why do they exist? I want to know about the regions. I think that a major problem with the regions is that since they are largely pulled from mods, we aren't given much information about them. The regions originally were connected to the grounds of Five Pebbles and Moon, and removing them from it would require the entire lore and story to be restructured. Of course, that doesn't automatically make it bad. There isn't anything stopping it from still being good. You could restructure their lore in a way that makes sense, but the DLC does not do that. And that highlights an important flaw in the DLC's world. The regions are hardly developed and hardly have any lore. The Signal Spires are an interesting region, sure, and I would like to know more about it, but I just won't get that information. Because, like, where are we? You cannot just introduce the idea of pyramid-shaped iterators that exist in an entirely different part of the world and then not expand on it any further. You would assume that a region called Signal Spires would have a plethora of lore pearls to find, similar to Sky Islands in Downpour, which had like 5, but no. You get one single pearl that isn't even related to Signal Spires. It's just an image of the drone from Artificer, which doesn't tell us anything. In fact, can we talk about lore pearls in the water? Lore pearls could have been an extremely good way to expand on the lore of the regions, but then a majority of the pearls don't tell us anything. I kid you not, out of the 17 pearls that are to be found in the water, only like 5 of them seem to be important in any way, shape, or form. They are either simply music, random images, or a joke of a text. The only ones that have anything in them are the ancient urban migration path, although I don't know if it's a joke or not, cold storage, outer rim, and the other ancient urban one. And that saddens me because the pearls had so much potential. I want to know more about Desolate Tract because we know practically nothing about it. I want to know more about Tor Desert, the Badlands, Heat Ducts, Turbulent Pump. These are all regions that desperately needed more world building to make me care for them. And the pearls were an amazing way to add it. But then it's just music. Seriously, was there nothing else to add there? Call me crazy, but I expect the lore pearl in Turbulent Pump to be connected to Turbulent Pump. Like, obviously, the base game had pearls that didn't directly tell us anything too. But even when they didn't, we would still get information in the form of Moon's thoughts on the matter. In fact, a huge part of the Pearl's purpose for the story came from seeing how Moon reacts to them and expanding on her character. Yes, the Outskirts Pearl may not tell us anything by itself, it's just a repeated mantra. The interesting stuff with it comes from the Moon's breakdown on how the cycle works and what it is. Maybe the devs don't want to add world building to the regions, but I struggle to imagine why. It's very clear that they want me to feel something for these regions, and world building is the way you would do that. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not saying that the water regions don't have any lore to them, but I am saying that we aren't given enough information about them to make me care for them, which takes a huge toll on the story's stakes. If I don't care for the regions, then why would I care when they get taken over by rot? The reason the rot worked in the base game and Downpour was because it was not only destroying regions we have come to care about along the course of the campaigns, but it was also a meaningful threat to the characters. The water regions being taken over by rot doesn't hit nearly as hard, because not only do I not care for the regions, but it isn't a threat to any of the characters either. The Echo will most likely already be gone by the time you gain the ending. The Prince is literally behind the rot and the Weaver is immune to it. And the Watcher is literally helping Spurs, so it's not like I'm going to feel sympathy towards him. If I don't care for the regions and the characters aren't in any direct danger, then the only stakes left in the story are the vague concept of the world being destroyed. And that's not really good writing now, is it? People like to say that the Watcher expands on the world, but it really doesn't. Not a single region outside of Outer Rim, Ancient Urban, which PS people can't even agree if it's real or not. And maybe Signal Spires actually expands on the world of the game or give us any information about the larger world or anything. Oh yeah, Turbulent Pipe. It pipes water somewhere. Where? Don't know! I don't really like the characters all that much either. I guess we should start with the, main character. The Watcher actually has a very good foundation for a character. The beginning intro immediately sets up a plethora of interesting ways the Watcher could develop. We see that his whole family was killed by a hostile Slack Cat as he simply watched and didn't take action. So the story should theoretically play with the guilt and trauma inflicted on the Watcher as a child. Either have him move on from it and change, or you have him sink deeper into it. And shockingly, the DLC actually does something good. The character of Spinning Top and the Watcher get developed over the course of the story. What good writing in my Watcher DLC! As they travel the world together, they grow attached to each other and are finally able to move on. The Echo is able to finally ascend, and the Watcher is able to live out his childhood, which he never got. They are both able to move on from the trauma. The Echo ending is the one ending that I would classify as good in isolation. You see, I like this ending on its own, but I think it's ultimately a detriment to the campaign as a whole. The thing with this ending is that it's usually the one which you get first, and by having the Watcher resolve all his problems in the very first ending, which you get in like the middle of the campaign, it leaves no room for the Watcher's further development. Compare that to Survivor and Artificer, the two Slack Cats with stories similar to the Watcher, yet both of their arcs only end at the end of the campaign. This is why the Watcher's character is stuck in limbo for the next three endings. Why does the Watcher help the Prince? Why does the Watcher help the Weaver? Why does the Watcher do anything outside of sitting in that bedroom in Ancient Urban? There is no reason for him to do any of that. From now on, the Watcher's character has no character. He does things just because the writers told him to do them. And if he does have a reason, we aren't given it. People like to compare the Watcher to the base game, except in the base game it actually made sense why Survivor followed the Overseer or why Hunter wanted to help Moon, which is also why the actual ending of the campaign falls flat. It doesn't end the story of the Watcher in a satisfying way. It's meant to be a conclusion of every character's journey, but it doesn't actually conclude anything other than the events of the campaign. What I mean by this is that the Ascension ending holds no weight for the Watcher's character, as his story has already ended. Which is why the Watcher throws into what I assume to be a void world. I think that the writers understood that the ending couldn't have been meaningful to the Watcher's character, which is why they chose to make it as vague and confusing as possible. From the Survivor campaign, we have been taught that Ascension can go two possible ways. You either ascend or you turn into an Echo. Usually, when a character ascends outside of the obvious notion of them dying, it also means something for their character. They achieve some kind of a personal goal. Survivor gets back to their family, Monk gets back to Survivor, Hunter gets reunited with NSH. Now, when a character turns into an Echo, it usually stems from a fundamental flaw in their character, a flaw that is stopping them from achieving that goal. If the Watcher ascended and saw their family, then it would simply be a repeat of the Echo storyline. If the Watcher turned into an Echo, then it would prove that he did not truly move on and would therefore also undermine the Echo ending. The writers have written themselves into a corner and they too recognize that. There is no way out of this situation. So they invent a third possibility, a one we have never seen before, a one that comes out of nowhere, and a one that ultimately means nothing. And of course everyone ate that up because, look, the Watcher turned to a void worm. I clapped, even though no one can actually agree on what it means. Let's go back a bit. As I mentioned earlier, the Watcher doesn't have a reason to actually help the Prince carry out his plan to turn everything to the rot. The reason this hurts the DLC outside of the obvious lack of characterization on the Watcher's part is that it also damages another character present in the campaign, the Weaver. You see, as is revealed to us later in the campaign, the Weaver, this strange entity that we can meet in various regions, is actually the Watcher, presumably from the future or some sort of other timeline entirely. But the Weaver being the Watcher also carries over the same problems that our Watcher has. If he's simply the Watcher that also met the Weaver and decided to work against the Prince, eventually becoming the Weaver, then, just like our Watcher, he had no reason to work with the Prince in the first place, which then means he didn't have any reason to betray the Prince and join the Weaver. The DLC does not tell us why the Weaver worked with the Prince or what caused the Weaver to turn against the Prince. The interesting thing with this is that the reason that the Weaver and the Watcher work with the Prince would be the exact same, and then the reason they turned against the Prince would also be the same, but there just isn't one. And also, if at this point in time the Watcher is working with the Prince, then you would expect for there to be conflict between the Watcher and the Weaver, right? But for fact, does the Watcher even believe in the Prince's cause or not? Because I'm having trouble figuring it out. I mean, he has to, right? What other reason could there have been for him to help the Prince? But then, what did the Weaver say or do to make him think otherwise? All his dialogue doesn't seem exactly like he's trying to convince the Watcher of something. All he says to the Watcher is that his actions are severely disrupting the war, but like, he already knew that. That's what he was doing to spread the rot. Okay, what I'm getting at is that since the Watcher has a problem with characterization, the Weaver has problems with characterization since they are the same character, and the DLC doesn't really do anything with him in the present day, after becoming the Weaver. When it comes to the Prince, I don't really want to talk about the Prince. There just isn't enough of information about him to be able to talk about at length. Although you should know that I don't consider him to be bad. It's just sort of missed potential once again. I just have to interpret a lot of information about him because a lot of his dialogue is purposely made to be as vague as possible. But the Prince actually reminds me of a more interesting thing that I want to talk about, which is what even is the Rot anymore, from a narrative standpoint. To understand how this DLC messed up the Rot, we need to understand what the Rot originally was in the base game, or rather what it symbolized to the characters, mainly that of Five Pebbles. The thing with the Rot in the base game is that it was the direct conclusion of the story of Five Pebbles. It was a permanent reminder that he didn't succeed in his plan to find the solution, that he failed to break the self-destruction taboo. Now, one of my problems with the base game is that it's never actually explained whether either will kill themselves is the solution to breaking the cycle, but at least it's made extremely clear that the Rot isn't a solution by the Sky Islands Pro. It's very clearly meant to be seen as a bad thing when compared to Ascension. The game makes it unambiguously clear that the Rot and Ascension are not equal. But when it comes to the Watcher DLC story, it's actually more ambiguous whether the Rot is meant to be a bad thing or not. On one hand, the game makes an effort to show the effects the Rot has on the world. The Rot lizards are perhaps the most horrifying creature in Rainworld because of how disgusting they are. The game even adds to that by having them make these terrible and scary sounds. The Echo speaks of the Rot in an extremely negative way, describing it as an extremely disgusting thing, and the Weaver obviously wants to stop the Prince's plan. So based on that, you would assume that the Rot is inherently a bad thing. However, the Watcher also wants to parallel the Rot and the Void Sea. An obvious example of this is the Rot Voidworm in Unfortunate Evolution. The Rot's color in the DLC is also purple, a color that is complementary to yellow, the color mainly associated with the Void Sea and Ascension. What this parallel is actually supposed to mean is unclear, although the Prince does describe his plan as a true end to the pattern. Now, the pattern is most likely the cycle. This probably means that both the Rot and the Void Sea are a solution to the same problem, although in different ways. And I don't really see what's wrong with it. Obviously, Ascension was also portrayed to be a good thing, and by paralleling the Rot to it, it makes the Rot seem like a good thing as well, which is where we get my issue. The Watcher cannot decide where it should portray the Rot to be a good thing or not. If it's meant to be a good thing, then that deals heavy damage to the previous events of the story in the base game. You can argue all you want that it's not technically the same Rot as the one from Five Pebbles, and I don't really buy that. The DLC very clearly wants to compare the two and connect them in some way. Again, Unfortunate Evolution comes to play. Even if this whole section is a dream, it still takes place in Unfortunate Development, and the game therefore makes a connection between it and the Purple Rot. There is also the fact that, we are forced to put a stop to it by getting the Weaver ending. You would think that if the Rot is the solution equal to the Ascension, then we will actually be given a choice of who to help, but the game forces us to stop the Prince, which implies that it's a bad thing. It may be more so a representation of what it could have been, but I don't see much of a purpose for it in that case. Remember, the Rot was never supposed to be a solution. It was inherently characterized as a failure. Making it stronger and at the peak of its potential would only make it more of a failure. Besides, I doubt that this was what Pebbles was trying to create in the first place. And if the rod is supposed to be taken as a bad thing, then I'm gonna need you to, show that and not just tell me it's bad and then never explain why. One could argue that it does do it with the corrupted regions and lizards, but it's not really much. Obviously, no creature would want to be killed regardless if that death will result in them ascending. It's not really the fault of the rod. I would also like to add that if the rod is supposed to be bad, then you would expect something bad would happen in the rod ending. But nothing happens except for being a bunch of karma flowers now. And then they try to convince you something bad just happened by playing ominous music in the credits, even though nothing bad actually took place. Maybe it's supposed to be bad because it kinda breaks reality, but I don't really see why it would be bad. If all life in the world literally gets ascended, then it doesn't matter if the world would be destroyed, because there isn't anyone that actually lives there anymore. Perhaps you can interpret what function they're supposed to have if you look at how it interacts with all the other characters outside of the prince. Yeah, it sort of doesn't. Spinktop only mentions it once, the Weaver never mentions it, and the Watcher is the Watcher. This also means that the DLC doesn't really expand on the rod as a concept. If it is the same rod Pebbles made, then it's thematically inconsistent with the base game. If it isn't the same rod, then we aren't actually expanding on the rod, but rather some different thing entirely. The rod being so confused thematically is the reason why I consider it to be bad, as it can't serve any actual purpose in the story. A huge problem with all of the Watcher's characters is that there simply isn't anything to talk about most of the time. Remember what I said earlier? Trying to tackle the Watcher's story is always going to act the ramp of an insane person. That's because these characters aren't good or bad or mediocre or anything. They are simply nothing. I cannot really analyze these characters because almost everything we learn about them has to be assumed. You have to make up information just to try and understand their characters. The Watcher isn't really a story, but rather a collection of interesting pieces and ideas, presented in a way so that you can put them together in any way to fit your theories. I know that may seem harsh, but it's what I think. Everyone is getting the story they want to get because they are making it up as they go along. With how much stuff in the campaign is left to viewer interpretation, I started feeling as if I'm writing the story for the writers. And if I continue to do that, to write the story for them, there isn't any incentive for them to actually try. The DLC is so vague that none of the stuff that happens in it means anything. The only thing that happens is your interpretation of the story, which may as well be fanfiction. This also means that the DLC restricts itself from exploring any deeper themes and ideas, because it refuses to give us a basic understanding of many things. How can you go any deeper when you get stopped at the surface? Of course, this doesn't pertain only to the characters, Unfortunate Evolution, Daemon, Outer Rim, Shattered Terrace, Karma Flowers. These are all components that are heavily important to a story, or at least seem to be, and yet aren't properly conveyed to the viewer. The fact that people can't even agree on whether Unfortunate Evolution even exists or not proves my point. If you were to ask any Rainworld fan what it actually is, you'd probably get as many answers as there are people in the world, because any interpretation of it you can make is just as valid as any other, because the devs refuse to give us any information that will actually tell us anything. Of course, there isn't anything wrong with having mystery in a story, but this isn't that. This isn't carefully building mystery and tension. This is deliberately withholding vital information and then not ever giving it, purposely keeping the viewer in the dark to elicit a sense of wonder. The viewer will be so caught up in imagining what these things could mean that they won't notice that it doesn't actually mean anything. People like to compare that to the base game story and how it was confusing too, so that must be the same thing. No. The thing with the base game is that its mysteries usually get answers. We know who Pebbles is, we know who Moons is, we know what an Iterator is, we know what Ascension is, the Ancients, Echoes. The base game gets clearer the more you play it, especially if you go for the core pearls. The Watcher's mysteries don't ever get explained. In fact, I would argue that the Watcher leaves you with more questions than you start with. In the base game, the stuff that is left more up to viewer interpretation is tied more to the religious stuff involved. Now, obviously, making a DLC all centered around that religious stuff would probably turn out to be vague and confusing, but it didn't have to be that way. I would personally want a DLC that's supposedly about expanding on those things to give me a better understanding of what they actually are. The base game knew when to give information and when to leave stuff mysterious. That's why all the iterators have had to exist within the story of the base game for it to be good. I am not asking for the game to tell me exactly what everything is. The only information I need is 1. What it means for the world, and 2. What it means for the characters. That's all the information you have to provide, and the Watcher doesn't even do that. Literally, all I want is for character actions to make sense, and to understand what's going on. Look, what I'm saying here is not that it isn't fun to theorize about the Watcher's story. I like watching theories and lore videos, and I have given the Watcher's story an excessive amount of thinking myself. But that doesn't really make for a compelling story. A huge problem with this style of writing is that the people will have to assume that the story makes perfect sense. Because when making a theory, you never know whether a contradiction you find was purposely put there by the writers to tell you that your theory is wrong, or is simply a result of bad writing present in the campaign, and any flaws you can find will inevitably be dismissed as you simply not understanding the story, even though no one actually does. In conclusion, I will always uphold that The Watcher is a DLC that's mediocre, not because it doesn't have any quality, but because it simultaneously has the best gameplay out of all the Rainbow campaigns, and the worst story. Well, that was it for the video. If you enjoyed what I had to say, then consider subscribing. If you agree with me, then please like the video. If you didn't agree with me, then please explain why in the comments, but be civil. Or don't be, do whatever you want really. Oh my god, I'm actually done with the fucking voiceover, finally!